Would you turn in your Bibles, please, to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 14. Matthew, chapter 14. A group of researchers wanted to study how different people think, so they brought a small group of folks and called for a little short test. Took people from different walks of life. The first one that came in the room with the researchers was an engineer. And they say, we have one simple question we want you to answer. 2 plus 2 equals what? And so the question was asked, and the engineer kind of looked quizzically and said, well, if you're speaking in absolute terms, 2 and 2 equals 4. They were writing notes down. They thanked him very much and dismissed him, and he went on his way. Next person to come in the room was an architect, and she sat down, and the researchers said, we have one question to ask you. 2 plus 2 makes what? And she paused a moment and said, well, there are several possibilities. Sure, 2 and 2 equals 4, but 3 and 1 also makes 4. 2.5 and 1.5 also makes 4. So it's all about choosing the right option. Spoken like an architect. The third person they brought into the room was an attorney. And they said, we have one simple question. 2 plus 2 equals what? The attorney looked at the researchers, looked around the room suspiciously, furtively, asked if he could close the door for privacy, came back to the table, leaned into the researchers and said, well, you tell me, what would you like it to be? Now, I know that attorneys often get the brunt of a lot of jokes like that, but there's a moral to this story. We can be tempted to do exactly that when it comes to the truth. We have truth, but the people hearing the truth may be offended if we speak the truth, and so we're tempted to sort of bend in their direction. What do you want it to be? What is your truth versus my truth? In Ephesians chapter 4, Paul said that we should be all about speaking the truth in love. And that's wonderful, but it's not always easy to do. We can be tempted to just focus on the truth, speaking the truth, and leave out the love. Or we can be all about love, 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 and we can leave out the truth. So speaking the truth in love is the magical combination. By the way, you need to know this. Speaking the truth in and of itself is an act of love. It is. One of the best, most loving things you could ever do to another person is to be honest, to tell them the truth, no matter what it is. If you can add to that a loving disposition, then you'll be further down the road. Solomon in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 said, there is a time to keep silence and there is a time to speak. Elijah the prophet thought it was time to speak when he confronted Ahab and Jezebel. Samuel the prophet thought it was time to speak when he confronted King Saul with his disobedience. Daniel the prophet believed it's time to speak when Belshazzar the king was pridefully indulging in idolatry. Nathan the prophet thought it was time to speak when he pointed his finger at King David after his adultery and said, you are the guy who did this. You're the man. All of them spoke up. Now, it is dangerous to speak up. We'll talk a little bit about that here. But you know, there are consequences if you don't speak up. It's dangerous if you don't. Edmund Burke is famous for a lot of things, but one of the most famous things he said is, all that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. And I think we could say with this message, all that is needed for evil to triumph is also for good men and women to say nothing. That was the problem in World War II in Nazi Germany, many of the churches were silent when the atrocities of the Third Reich became known. I picked up a book again recently. I think you've heard of it, 1984 by George Orwell. It's amazing how contemporary that book has become these days. George Orwell said this: "If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they don't want to hear." I believe that, but I also believe that what complicates telling people what they may not want to hear is that today especially, people get offended so easily. In fact, I think it's not beyond the stretch to say ours is the most offended generation in all of history. And you say something and people need a safe space to process that in. In Matthew chapter 14, it's a very refreshing story, really. It's a story about a man of God who confronts a governing authority, and he speaks up, he speaks out, he is not silent. He overcomes the giant of silence, but it cost him. It cost him his life in this case. What I want to do is look at the first 10 verses of Matthew chapter 14 with you. I want to consider it in 3 segments. The first segment being the guilty conscience of a politician. So it's John the Baptist and a politician named Herod the Tetrarch, and it's really not a story about them per se. It's a story about how Herod is reacting to the ministry of Jesus. But then Matthew harkens back to an example to show us why he is feeling a certain way because of something that happened. Let's read the story. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the report about Jesus and said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him." For Herod had laid hold of John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had said to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." And although he wanted to put him to death, he feared the multitude because they counted him as a prophet. But when Herod's birthday was celebrated, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. Therefore, he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. And in Mark's account of this same story, he said that Herod promised her up to half his kingdom. So she, verse 8, having been prompted by her mother, said, "Give me John the Baptist's head here on a platter." And the king was sorry. Nevertheless, because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he commanded it to be given to her. So he sent and had John beheaded in prison. The name Herod is one of the most famous names in all of the New Testament. But whenever you read the name Herod, they're not always the same guy. It's a very complex family system. The Herod that we read about here is not the famous Herod that shows up in the beginning of the gospel stories, who is called Herod the Great. Now, Herod the Great, who is the father of this Herod, was a notorious, cold-blooded murderer. He would kill members of the Jewish ruling class, Sanhedrin, if they disagreed with his policies. He, on one occasion, murdered his own wife. He, on another occasion, murdered 2 of his sons. He, on another occasion, did murder all the baby boys in Bethlehem and the environs to kill Jesus Christ. That's Herod the Great.